One of the things the Prime Minister said was, he said that child abuse in this country was at an industrial scale. Do you think that's true?
Yes.
And what does that mean?
I think it's everywhere. I think it's everywhere that people haven't expected to find it. I think it's traditionally people might have thought it happened to people from less well-off backgrounds or whatever. It's not true. It's everywhere. It's everywhere.
And yet, Nicola Beckwood, the measures proposed today, we're told in Oxford, wouldn't have resulted in anyone being prosecuted, anyone else being prosecuted.
Well, the specific measure of the criminal offence may not have, but a number of the other measures would have made a significant difference. For example, introducing the new helpline for whistleblowers would have made a major difference. One of the big problems that occurred was that when frontline individuals found a problem and they tried to raise it with senior managers, they weren't taken seriously. And if that helpline had been in place, this situation might have been dealt with earlier, and some of those victims might have been protected and protected earlier.
But what I don't understand is if, as we're hearing, girls were going to the police in these circumstances, saying they were being abused and they were being sent away, why wasn't that willful neglect? Why wasn't that something which should have been reported on a mandatory basis? Why wouldn't this new law, if in place, have made any difference?
Well, that's an issue for lawyers and thresholds, but that's exactly why there's going to be a consultation on introducing the offence of willful neglect, but also while there's going to be a consultation on mandatory reporting, because mandatory reporting would catch some of these issues under that threshold, which would be incredibly important for just these issues that you're talking about. But I do think that we have to have the consultation, because what we don't want to have is loads of reports which don't need to go through and are inappropriate, clogging up the system. What we want to have is proper identification and proper training, so that the cases which do need to be referred are identified and dealt with as quickly as possible. And what we have is the gold standard, which is children prevented from being abused, rather than having to go through the system and then prosecutions having to take place.
Do you think these measures proposed are going to make much difference in practice?
Well, I think it's a really positive step from government from where we were a year ago, where these discussions were taking place, a lot of campaigning around bringing in mandatory reporting. But let's look at what willful neglect means in legal terms. So the legal threshold is deliberate or conscious failure to act in accordance with your duty resulting in negligence. And that's a very high threshold. And what we saw from last week's report, the NHS reports into the Savile abuse in hospitals, was that many of those victims wouldn't have been protected by this move. And what we essentially need is a bolt-on. So there has to be mandatory reporting working hand in hand with this new proposal. And we welcome the fact that the government are continuing to consult on mandatory reporting alongside this new announcement.
I suppose part of this is psychological, in as much as people are not naturally willing to assume that this is going on this scale, and so there is a tendency to dismiss it if you don't know about it.
Well, there might be, but actually one of the things that came out of today, I think there were three things actually, but there was we need to get people to have professional curiosity, and that is not just people who have responsibility. People do need to develop that, and it's using your antenna and working with that, listening and believing and understanding children and young people, and actually those who are vulnerable generally. This includes people with learning disabilities, anybody who really is in the care of the state as a corporate parent or a carer, then that needs to happen as well. But the other thing is that people need to understand this is a crime. It's a crime, full stop. And there are a number of things you were talking about, measures that we might take. There are things like prevention orders, and in other parts of the world they actually bring in an initial threshold where there's suspicion and just ask people to stay away from an individual. That doesn't necessarily mean you're guilty, but it means that there's protection in place and that the risk is assessed, and then you can go full forward with court cases which take sometimes 1 and 2 or 3 years to get into court. That's the danger time.
I mean, as I understand it, some of these vulnerable young girls were voluntarily absconding and voluntarily associating.
I don't think you should voluntarily.
But this raises the very important point that one of the problems at the time was the victims were seen as consenting to their abuse, and they were seen as the architects of their own downfall, which is not at all what was going on. This was a symptom of the grooming which they had experienced.
But they were running away and meeting with these men.
There's no such thing as consent if you're underage. There is no consent.
I accept that, but what I'm saying is, what can you do about that? I mean, would you physically
Well, there are a number of
girls.
well,
I mean,
no, but what you need
stop
to
it?
well, this is exactly what Tessa has just been talking about in terms of a number of the prevention orders. The focus needs to be taken away from just stopping the victims from doing things and actually addressing the crimes which the perpetrators are committing. We have brought in a huge number of civil prevention orders which are able now to disrupt the grooming gangs, give some space to the victims so that they then are able to reflect on what's been happening to them, and then often after that period they look back and say, hang on a second, this isn't right. The way I've been treated is not what I've been conditioned to think, which is this is a romantic relationship, this is love. This is actually abuse, and I'm willing perhaps to
I'm just wondering who's going to do that. Who's going to do that?
This is the multi-agency work. This is the police, the social workers, the NHS, the teams working together. If they work individually as in silos, it doesn't work.
What we essentially need is a legal framework that provides protection from people in professional bodies, regulated activities, social workers, nurses, teachers, who, where they suspect abuse, whether or not it's somebody who is in a vulnerable situation, somebody who is, you know, going into those very vulnerable situations, thinking that they're consenting or not, they have a compunction to report that. It takes out the hesitation because there is a legal framework.
But then someone has to identify who is doing the grooming or the abusing as well, don't they? Before you can stop it.
Yes, but you need to create space so that those who are victims at the time, you've become a survivor later, but if you're a victim, you need to have space so that you can have all of the support that you need to, exactly as Nicola said, to reflect. But you can only reflect when the peril is away. And so actually we need to make sure that there is the ability to actually remove the perpetrator, not the victim, always the perpetrator, out of the picture. And it may be that some people who are maybe assumed to be carrying out inappropriate behaviour and are not, they can be proven to be not guilty later, but actually we need to protect victims first.
OK, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.